Douglas Sinclair, I have been a fan of for many years since he started. I don't know how I found him, but I did. And I read Indigenous Watchdog. I pray over what I read. And I publish as part of the weekly Indigenous News Digest that comes out every second week now. But I'm not changing the name because it doesn't work. Blah. So anyway, there have been many references to Douglas's work in when I do the topic of reconciliation or the TRC. Douglas follows in a line of speakers that we have had that's included Murray Sinclair in this spot, and John Ralston Saul, Michael China, who is here, and many others who have come to speak to us reconciliation. Douglas has a particular and most helpful approach to our ReconciliAction. And I welcome Douglas from the Peguis Nation, and this floor is yours. Oh, phones off, please. I was a judge for 36 years. I know what to do with these things, and you won't get it back. Excuse my back, Douglas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome.
First of all, thank you, Pam, and I'd like to thank the Church of the Redeemer as well for inviting me to participate in the ReconciliAction. So, as you can see, what is the status of reconciliation? This is a critical question, and it's a very important question, especially when you consider that in 2 weeks from now will be the 10th year anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issuing the summary report with their 94 calls to action. And Indigenous Watchdog was established in 2019. And in that time, the singular question and focus of the work that is done is to answer a question. And that is reconciliation advancing or not? And if not, why? Because it's important to understand, is there progress being made? Where is it being made? How is it being made? And who is making the right actions and who is not? And to hold those people accountable, or organizations or governments, to move the needle and move reconciliation to where it has to be eventually successful. And because Indigenous Watchdog is distinctions-based, and what that means is it focuses on issues that are critical to First Nations, as well as to Métis, as well as to Inuit, because the three distinctive organizations each have their own sets of issues and needs and problems that have surfaced that impact their ability to live successfully in Canada. So I'm going to start with a slightly different territory acknowledgement, and this one is to honor the homelands of the three distinct groups. So first of all, the Inuit homeland and Inuit Nunangat. And so you have Nunavut, you have Inuvialuit in the Northwest Territories, Nunavik in northern Quebec, and Nunatsiavut in Newfoundland and Labrador. And then you have the Métis homelands in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, extending into the territories in Alberta, British Columbia, and northwestern Ontario. And then finally, the First Nations, 634 First Nations across the country, coast to coast to coast. And there's 12 distinct language groups and 70 languages within those First Nations across the country. So it's a very large, distinct group of peoples that have been in this country, Kanata, as they say, time immemorial. So what I'm going to do today is, on the agenda, there's basically four things. One is to provide some historical context in order to put reconciliation into a context of why it's necessary. Secondly, just give a brief overview of Indigenous Watchdog, who we are, what we do, and why, because it's important to understand just exactly what the overall mission and purpose of the site and the organization is in terms of moving the needle on reconciliation. Second is going to be third is going to be a high-level view in terms of what are the actual issues that are holding reconciliation back. because you'll see when we get to that section, there's some significant problems in terms of where reconciliation sits today. And so that section is designed to look at a high level. This is what the problems are. This is where it's happening. And then it gets a little bit more deeper in terms of these are the specific calls to action where there's problems. And there's a handout that was at the front that has explanations of all the calls to action that have not started, all the ones that have stalled, explaining just exactly what the rationale is, so that you can go and see just exactly what the reason for that is. And then the fourth thing is doing more of a deep dive. Okay, now we've done the sort of high-level overview. Okay, now what are the specific actions or problems within each of the calls, well, some of the calls to actions, and focusing on the ones where there's been some issues. So the first thing you see when you go to the Indigenous Watchdog site is this image of a wampum belt. And superimposed on the wampum belt is a statement, 262 years of promises made and promises broken. And so what that represents is that the treaties, and this is important, especially when you think of King Charles coming to read the throne speech as a representative of the Crown for Canada, it's also a representative of who the treaties have relationships with, which is the Crown. It's not with Ontario, it's not with Manitoba, it's not with Saskatchewan, or not with BC. And we'll get into more just about that as we go along. But the wampum belt, just as a brief explanation, the 3 rows of white beads that you see represent peace, respect, and friendship. And the 2 rows of purple beads that you see, one represents European laws and traditions and culture, the other represents Indigenous cultures, laws, and traditions. And they go parallel to each other, they don't interfere with each other, they don't get in each other's ways. They're respecting each other as entities that are sharing the land that they are now living on. And that's the whole purpose. And I think that the image of the wampum belt says so much more eloquently what the power of treaty is versus any kind of, when you look at the Royal Proclamation, which was issued by King George III in 1763. And this was after the 7 Years' War, in terms of how the countries were being managed. And in that Royal Proclamation, it was made clear that Aboriginal title exists. They have title, ownership of the land, of the resources, of all that is there, and is to be lived in partnership with colonial entities. In 1764, there were 84 wampum belts that were exchanged between 24 First Nations to sort of ratify and solidify that connection between the Crown and the Indigenous tribes at that time in terms of the Aboriginal rights and title that existed and perpetuates. After that, you look at 1867 when Canada was formed. That was the start of Canada as an entity needing to expand west and looking at and seeing the Indians as a problem. They were in the way, and they had to come up with mechanisms to be able to control the expansion of the settler colonial construct west. And in that process, that's when they started all the assimilation policies that became evident through the residential school system, among others. And my father was a residential school survivor from Fort Alexander School in Manitoba. One other thing just to bear in mind quickly, at the same time that this was happening, at the end of the 19th century was the collapse of the Indigenous economy. Up until that point, Indigenous and white settlers, not settlers, but the fur trade, it was an equal relationship. And they were on a par. But when the fur trade collapsed, followed by the buffalo disappearing on the plains, led to all sorts of, you had the disease and you had the starvation, in fact, impacting Indigenous peoples across the West. Combine that with the train the creation of the CP rail going across. And what the government did, they used the starvation tactics in order to force Indigenous people off the land and onto reserves. And there's a book actually called Clearing the Plains, which is one of few awards that documents in meticulous detail just exactly how that was done and what the ramifications and results of that have been to the Indigenous people at that time. So why is reconciliation necessary? The Indian Act was enacted in 1876. And this was designed really to curtail and constrain the ability of Indigenous people to be able to live their lives. I just wanted to focus on a few other things. One was the right to vote. My father was a career soldier in the Canadian Army. He fought in the Second World War from 1939 to 1945. He fought in the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. He was in the UN peacekeeping mission in Egypt in 1957. He was one of thousands and thousands and thousands of Indigenous people. They only got the right to vote in 1960. Up until that time, Indigenous people were not allowed to vote in the land that they were willing to go and die for. So what does that say about at that time, the commitments and the injustices that have been allowed to perpetuate? The other thing was in 1921, a Haudenosaunee leader went to the League of Nations to complain about treaty violations within his territory. The Canadian government's response was to outlaw political organizations so that Indigenous people could not gather in groups of more than a few people. It was illegal for them to hire a lawyer. And if a lawyer dared to represent an Indigenous group or person, they were threatened with being disbarred. So you can see that the whole Indian Act was really designed to constrain, restrict, and control. And in fact, from the time it was enacted until 1951, an Indian could not even leave the reserve unless they had permission. So there's a lot of issues around how things were sort of forced on the Indigenous populations. What you see next is after about 100 years or so, the governments of the day recognize, okay, we have a problem here. There's the Indian population is marginalized, they're impoverished. What are we going to do about it to fix the problem? And so now we've had 65 years of reports, commissions, what have you, and you can see which ones ignored, canceled. You just sort of scratch your head and wonder what's next, what's going to happen next. And just want to do two things. Kelowna Accord was the first time that all of the federal, provincial, territory governments, Indigenous groups, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, came together, agreed collectively that this is what the legislation is going to be that will close the gap between the Indigenous problems and Canadians and close that gap. The first thing that Stephen Harper did when he came into power was to cancel that agreement. And you think about that. This was the first time that collectively all the governments of Canada had agreed, and Harper, with one stroke of the pen, threw it out the window. And before I get into the TRC and what this meeting is about, in 2012, Stephen Harper, and this is important, Stephen Harper introduced a bill, an omnibus bill, and it was designed to fast-track infrastructure projects, designed to get pipelines, to get mining, get all these different resource extraction industry projects in the ground and proceeding as fast as possible. And the reason to do that, or the way to do that, was to curtail environmental assessments. Make sure they could override, don't let environmental issues get in the way. Don't let Indigenous consulting, Indigenous treaties, Indigenous territories get in the way. Don't let society in general get away. Just go ahead and steamroll this thing through. The end result was 4 Indigenous women in Saskatoon started something called Idle No More, which within a year swept the country and led to all of these protests, coast to coast to coast, to prevent that legislation from happening. And why that's important today is you look at Bill 5 in Ontario, the fast-tracking projects. You look at Bill 45 in BC, exactly the same thing, infrastructure project, override environmental assessments, override duty to consult. Language bill, Bill 96 in Quebec. The Alberta, the sovereignty referendum they want to have. All of these are fundamentally pushing aside Indigenous rights, and they're disavowing treaty relationships. And those treaty relationships, as they say, are with the Crown. It's not a relationship with Ontario or with Saskatchewan or with Alberta or with the ministers of BC. It's a federal relationship. And we'll get into a bit more discussions about that a little bit later. So Indigenous Watchdog. There's 2 fundamental reasons that it exists. First of all, is to hold stakeholders accountable. That's number 1, just exactly identify who is doing what that is good, who is doing stuff that is not good, and flag it and post it and say that this is what is happening. Secondly, is to educate, inform, and empower users, Canadians that are accessing the site by providing and curating a wealth of information that comes from credible sources to allow them to be able to articulate their own actions and perspectives in moving the needle on reconciliation. And so the site itself, The information is organized in a way that is very easy to navigate, easy to search. And there's universities are using it, unions are using it, churches are using it, students, researchers. I mean, there's quite a broad spectrum from society. And the one thing they say is that it's easy to find the information that they're looking for. It's organized so that you can search by First Nations, by Métis, by Inuit. You can search by jurisdiction. You can go to Saskatchewan, Manitoba, whatever the province or the territory is. You can go by the theme, whether it's child welfare, justice, or health, whatever it is. It's very easy to navigate through the site, to find the information, and you'll see in a second just how pervasive that information is that's available. And the idea, again, is to make the information accessible so that people can enable themselves or their organizations to be able to articulate and put in place the solutions that will help to close that gap between what's keeping Indigenous peoples marginalized in society. So what main thing here is to establish the authority and the credibility of the site. So there's 11 primary sources that are used every single day, 365 days a year. The site, these 11 sources are scanned. Anything that is relevant on an Indigenous issue falls into any one of the 30 themes that are identified. And within those themes, there's now another 700 sub-themes. So all of the organization is neatly identified, slotted, and put in the right spot so that anybody can go in and find the information they want. And of those, this shows you here between 2023 and 2025, I just focused on that 28-month period, there's 6,214 posts that have been put on. That's strictly for the calls to action. It doesn't include the government commitments, it doesn't include the background content. And the background content for all of the different themes and for all of the calls to action, there's a wealth of information, just background content to provide further context, further information, further detail, solution-focused, again, to allow people to find the information that can move the needle on that reconciliation idea, whatever it happens to be. So this is where we stand today. As of May 1st, 37% of all the calls to action are either not started or they're stalled. There's 14 that are not started, there's 21 that are stalled, and there's a handout at the back that I mentioned that has details about exactly why they're not started, why they're stalled. And I just wanted to point out at the bottom, there's January 18th, 2024. The Minister of Indigenous Services came out, Crown Indigenous Services came out and said that Canada says 85% of the calls to action are either complete or well in progress. And so this post is basically a rebuttal to that and shows that it's really only about 56%, I think it is, something like that. So there's a huge disconnect between what the government says that they are doing, what they're realizing, what their attainment levels are, and what the reality is. And just as three things. First of all, you'll notice that there has been progress. From September 2019, it was at 43%, now it's at 37%. So there's been a 6 percentage point increase in that period of time, 1% a year. Not a heck of a lot, but at least it's some movement. Secondly, the 37% has been at 37% for 4 years. So 4 years' time, despite all of the activity, all the actions, all the commitments, that needle hasn't moved, hasn't budged. Well, it's budged a bit. Then it goes back and forth. But it's roughly been 37% for that period of time. So what's the problem? That's really the fundamental question that I think arises when you look at all of the efforts that are going into moving the bar on reconciliation. You know, there's from my perspective, there are 4 main barriers that get in the way. Number 1 is the lack of political will across all jurisdictions, and that's federal, provincial, territory, municipal, to address fundamental issues around Aboriginal rights and title, Indigenous laws and governance, and treaty rights. And despite all the things you read in the press about duty to consult and free, prior, and informed consent, and their commitment to do that, the actions don't bear that out. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but that, to me, that's the number 1 issue. Number 2 is very important as well, which is systemic racism. It's still entrenched throughout all sectors of society. And if you look at these 4 that are highlighted here, child welfare, education, health, and justice, are 4 of the 5 foundational, fundamental calls to action themes that impact the day-to-day quality of life of Indigenous people across the country. Of all of the posts in that 28-month period, all of the posts relating to child welfare, 28% were flagged as systemic racism. For education, 33%. For health, 39%. For justice, 64%. And that justice one that's basically systemic racism in general, systemic racism in police, systemic racism with the RCMP, and then targeted Indigenous groups like missing and murdered Indigenous women. So it's, you can see that it's 10 years after the calls to action were first issued to have this level of disconnect where the needle has not moved. There's something fundamentally wrong. If you look at the number 3, structural barriers, these are things that are structurally embedded within the systems. Like you look at the National Indigenous Health Benefit Program, they have a hotline for people to call in. They have very few Indigenous people that are answering the phones. They have no cultural understanding of the people that are calling in. A lot of the people that they would like to have on that call line, a lot of people won't sign up because the bureaucracy takes months and months and months to pay people. So councillors don't want to sign up. I mean, why would they want to sign up and do things and not get paid for it? Housing, there's no building codes on reserves. And then you wonder why there's problems with housing on reserves, which has been an issue. Anyway, so there's structural embedded things like that have not been fixed. And the last thing is the lack of quality data. If you really want to have the ability to develop sound policy, you have to have solid research based on clear, accurate data so that you can define and articulate what you can do to fix things. This slide here just shows you what the problem is. And these are, again, those foundational, fundamental areas that impact Indigenous lives. Child welfare, education, health, and justice all have calls to action specific to providing annual reports where the federal government, the provincials, and the territories would get together and combine and be able to articulate and share the knowledge that they can build through accessing the data. They're not doing it. And you have to ask yourself why. I mean, you look at the pandemic and how quickly they were able to put together the mechanisms to be able to fight a COVID pandemic coast to coast within months. Why can't they just, I mean, my background is in technology. There's no reason technologically why you can't allow access to data from different, the provinces have the data. The federal government has the data. They're not sharing it, they're not making it accessible. And that's wrong. And the last thing to focus on this slide is the National Council for Reconciliation. The National Council was the foundational governance body identified by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to monitor and track and report on how governments and stakeholders are responding and reporting on the progress of reconciliation. Fundamental, National Council, that was the body, the governance body. This is the organization, Indigenous-led, independent of government, that is going to be able to look out over the whole country on a consistent basis and through a report to Parliament, through the Prime Minister, make an annual report to Canadians in terms of this is the status of reconciliation. This is the reality of what we're doing. This is the reality of the roadblocks. These are the problems, and this is what we're going to do to fix it. It took them till 2 weeks ago to finally, 2 months ago, in March, the beginning of March, they finally enacted, through the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, the National Council was established as a legal entity. So now they have 18 months to operationalize their work. It took them 10 years to get to that point. And when you see that, you just have to question and wonder, what is going on with government that it takes them that long to do something that is so fundamental to be able to track and see what is going on with reconciliation. So now we're going to take it down a notch. So now we're going into the specifics about the calls to action themselves. So this gets more specifics about where the problems are. And you'll see here that there's, I haven't taken all 14 of the ones not started, but there's 10. 2 of them are already on the previous one, 2 and 9. The ones I'm going to focus on are the Royal Proclamation. Hasn't even been looked at. Hasn't been started. Hasn't even made a blip in terms of progress. And the Royal Proclamation, the way it is worded in the calls to action, is that they want to build on the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Basically update it so that it's current with things like the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights, the rebuttal of the refutement of the Doctrine of Discovery in Terra Nullius. And for those that don't know, the Doctrine of Discovery was a papal bull that was issued in the 15th century, which basically allowed colonial powers at that time, Spain and Portugal, to basically carve up the New World. And it was basically Terra Nullius. Nobody lived there. It wasn't Christian, so it was no one lived there, so it's open book. Help yourselves to whatever you find. So that was what the Doctrine of Discovery, and that really underpins, despite what governments say, the refusal to allow indigenous laws and governance to get in the way of resource extraction projects that are rampant across the country, especially now in BC, Ontario, and Alberta and Saskatchewan, actually, and in Quebec, because they, as far as those governments are concerned, the land is theirs, the resources are theirs, and that's what the Sovereignty Bill of Alberta is like. The Saskatchewan Sovereignty Bill that they have is like a claim against of resources. And that's premised on the fact that the Doctrine of Discovery is what they rely on to be able to make that statement. And so again, that's despite what they say, and this is why you see all of the First Nations, and even in the Inuit, or the Métis, objecting and saying that you're not honoring the relationships or the treaties that have been bound in order to frame that relationship that we have. The last thing, again, the National Council, I've already talked about that one. But again, these are fundamental issues that have not been addressed. There's 21 calls to action that have been stalled. These ones, again, it's the fundamental ones, like child welfare, education, language and culture, enact an Indigenous Language Act. They did. The federal government enacted an Indigenous Language Act. It was over the objections of the Inuit because they didn't incorporate the recommendations that the Inuit Taprit Kanatami, the governing body for the Inuit in Canada, wanted to see in the Act. They ignored it. They didn't include it. That's 71 and 77. 71, the missing children and burial information. One of the calls to action, 71, has to deal specifically with coroners and vital statistic agencies providing their records to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. A number of them still have not done that. They're still withholding the information. Same with the 77, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, asking the archives to turn over their records. And this has been one of the issues that have been flagged by the Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Burial Information, when she made her final report, was documenting these entities are not making the information available. And when you look at just backtrack a little bit to the missing children and burial information and all the ground searches for missing children, it's essential from a First Nations perspective that they identify as closely as they can where those children are. And we'll get into one of the issues that we'll identify in one of the other slides is residential school denialism. Because it's people muddying the water and focusing on show me the body, show me the body. And that's missing the whole point. The whole point is identifying who the children are. And governments are not cooperating when they don't make the records that they have in their possession available to the Indigenous bodies that want to use that information to be able to work with the schools to identify and document who these children are. So now we go on to which ones have been complete. So there's 14 that have been complete. And just to put it into perspective, the CBC has a site called Beyond 94. And they do similar work to what I'm doing. They track the calls to action. They say that there's 17 that have not started. And they say that there's 29 that are projects proposed, not started, but proposed. They're still somewhere sort of in limbo. So they're actually a bit sterner than Indigenous Watchdog in terms of the way that they rank, how responsive the governments and stakeholders have been in doing things. The ones that are highlighted in 4, they're technically complete. If you look at Call to Action 41, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the call to action calls for an inquiry. Okay, they did an inquiry, they checked the box and said, yes, we've done this, we've completed it. That inquiry had 230 recommendations for calls for justice. It's not going to be anywhere near complete until those 230 calls to justice have been dealt with, addressed, and rectified to some degree. Same with commemoration call to action 80, which is about creating a statutory holiday. Okay, the federal government created a statutory holiday. They checked the box, yes, we did this, so they considered it complete. But the reality is that there's 7 provinces that represent 67% of the Indigenous population in Canada that have not created a statutory holiday. They ignore it and they won't do it. It's Quebec, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and some of the maritime provinces as well. But that 67% of the Indigenous population don't have the ability to have a statutory holiday the way the rest of Canada does. So, when I look at the site, when you have the calls to action, which is sort of at the granular level, call to actions 1 through 94. So you have specific actions that are ranked for those. Above that, you have something called government commitments. And these government commitments at a macro level, this is what governments are saying at a high level. This is what we are going to do for reconciliation. And then the calls to action, that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Right? Because at the top level, they're saying this is what our commitments are. The calls to action are how are they actually delivering on that. And you'll notice that the number one area for both commitments and for problems is treaty relationships and Indigenous rights. So what does that say? I mean, it seems to say that they're not walking the talk. They're saying one thing about treaties, it could be duty to consult, free, prior, and informed consent, or it could be, on the other hand, that they're overriding Indigenous rights. You look at, as an example, probably the most prominent one is the Wet'suwet'en objections to Coastal GasLink. And if you look at that, it was the hereditary chiefs who had legal recognition by the Supreme Court that they were the title holders and the ones responsible for the management of the Wet'suwet'en territory. And when it came to the government in Coastal GasLink, they focused on the chiefs, the elected chiefs, which are Indian Act government organization. I mean, it can get a bit confusing because you have the elected chiefs who manage the reserve, and the reserve itself is a small piece of what the overall territory is. The hereditary chiefs are the ones enacted by Indigenous laws and culture to manage the overall territory and what impacts the territory. It was the hereditary chiefs that objected to it. And the government's response was, so what? They overrode what they wanted to say and just plowed ahead anyway. And this also, the bottom of the screen shows the distribution of Indigenous populations in Canada. And you notice Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Quebec have been highlighted because when it comes to the commitments, like being able to make actual commitments to Indigenous people, Alberta is number 7, Saskatchewan number 9, and Quebec number 11. So they're not exactly indicating through their actions that they're willing to progress solid steps forward to enable reconciliation to happen. And the site, I mean, there's a lot of information to take in, but the site, if you have the opportunity or the time to casually go through the site, you'll be able to find the substantiation for all of this. So this is another way of looking at the government commitments. So you can see that Canada obviously has the most. They represent, they look after 78 of the calls to action are federal. Provinces and territories are a subset of that as well. So these are the ones, these are just examples of some of the positive things that have been taking place. Like in New Brunswick, the previous Conservative government was thoroughly opposed to the Wolastoqey land claim settlement. The new Liberal government came in and they've gone into negotiation because they wanted to see something positive happen. You've got Mark Carney saying on April 25th that he's committed to reforming child welfare. So it's important that part. The BC has put out a decolonization roadmap about how they're going to decolonize it. And BC has been much further ahead than other provinces. They've set up 15 Indigenous justice courts throughout the province to address issues through a bit more of an Indigenous lens. So they're way ahead of anybody else in the country in terms of those kinds of things. They also, just recently, BC and Canada, recognized Haida Gwaii and transferred full authority and control of 10,000 square kilometers of their territory, saying that they have full control of that. So there is all sorts of positive things that are happening. And just unfortunately, it's sort of dwarfed by some of all the negative stuff that's been happening. In terms of problems, how is the time coming? Doing fine? Okay, so the current problems. Like I just finished saying, BC is the most progressive government in terms of the positive things that they're doing. They also, as you can see, have the most problems with some of the things that they're doing. So you have to wonder what the heck where's the truth in all of this? And that was one of the things I was struggling with this when I was trying to formulate the talk. There were 600 and some odd, there's 6,000 posts in the 28-month period. And so I'm sort of highlighting some of the things just to give a sense. But if you really want to get a better understanding, and actually one way to do that is that every month, within the first week usually, there's a post that gets put out saying what's new in Indigenous Watchdog. And that post identifies all of the posts that have gone into the site, and there's roughly between 220 to 250 every month that go into the site. But it's all sorted out on that post. This is what's new in government commitments. This is what's new in child welfare. This is what's new in the call to action 1 through 94. Just what's happened in that month. So you can see at a snapshot, in a 10-minute read, you've got an insight into what's happening and where the problems are, because it also has current problems. So everything that goes on the site is sorted out, published at the beginning of every month, so everyone has an opportunity. I mean, that's where you'll get, I think, some of this better insight, I guess, into what these slides are indicating. So this slide is just, it's designed for one thing, and that's really just to show the gap between the positive things that are happening and the negative things that are happening. And you can see just the red is the negative, the gold is the positive. And you can see just at a glance that of all of these 6,000 and some odd posts, 29% were positive, 71% were negative. And so I've asked myself sometimes, why is that? And it could be that just a media bias, that it's easy to report bad stuff that's going on rather than good stuff. It could be just the governments haven't been as free in promoting some of the things that they're doing, some of the positive stuff, because there just is not the same depth of information in terms of what different stakeholders are doing that is positive. So when you look at the calls to action, these are the themes that have the most activity. So of all of the stuff that's happening in the last 18 months, health is number 1. Justice is number 2. Environment number 3. Education, housing, treaties and land claims. These are of all of the themes, of those 30 themes, these are the ones that have most of the activity, where you see most of the action taking place. In health, I think if you look at 3 of these things, I'll look at health, environment, and housing. If you look at all 3 of those, I mean, those have been issues within Indigenous worlds for decades. But all 3 of those, if you think about it, are now mainstream. These are mainstream issues that have rippled through, and I think that they're impacting, because you look at housing, has been a problem for decades within Indigenous communities, especially in the north and on reserves. It's just been a problem. But it's also a problem for mainstream society now. So there's much more reporting, there's much more resources, there's much more focus on housing. And so it's moved up, it's displacing some of the other things that are happening, some of the more core issues. Environment, climate change is now top of mind for a lot of people. And so you see a lot of the reporting that is now out, and because First Nations and Inuit are impacted more directly and immediately by impacts from climate change and from industry, there's much more reporting and much more visibility into it. What was the other one? Yeah, one thing was a bit of an anomaly, was the business of reconciliation, which, I mean, if you look at the call to action, it's about businesses using United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights as a framework to how they would relate with Indigenous communities where they're doing work. Because there's a lot of, not just mining, but like the banks They all have presences in the Indigenous communities. But the big thing is that instead of responding to the call to action, there's much more focus on economic reconciliation. It's more around, I get a kick out of Ontario saying that they're going to create a loan program to allow Indigenous people to buy money so they can get capital equity to infrastructure projects. I mean, to me, it's like someone going into someone's house and saying, I'm going to loan you money so you can buy the furniture in your house. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, because there should be, in my view, there should be a royalty payment that goes to Indigenous people whose resources are in the land that they live on. It's their territory. You want to take resources out, pay them a royalty. Simple. And if you look at the Royal Superior Huron settlement, $10 billion is what they were given by the Supreme Court of Canada in payment for Canada and Ontario not honoring the treaty that was signed over 100 years ago, where they limited the fee that each individual got was $4.50, I believe it is. And this was an annuity fee that was supposed to go up every year as the wealth increased going out of the territory. Ontario and Canada didn't bother until it went to court. And they actually got reprimanded, both governments of Ontario and Canada, by the Supreme Court, that was an abominable, atrocious way to honor a treaty by not paying people at what you said you were going to pay them. Anyway, got a bit sidetracked there. So which calls to action had the most activity? These were the ones of all of the positives, all the stuff. It's number 18, which is health. And this health has to do with this one, it's the call to action is recognize and implement the healthcare rights. And so this is really any sort of positive government programs in terms of improving the health outcomes. And one of the reasons I think that it's been up is because some of the issues, like when you look at the pandemic, there was a lot of focus on the pandemic, and First Nations across the country had the highest death outcomes as a result of the pandemic, just as it was with H1N1 before. So it seems like whenever there's a health issue like a pandemic, it's the First Nations in the country that really are the ones that get hit the hardest. So now, post-pandemic, you now have an opioid crisis, and you have the mental health issues, and all of mainstream health is focused on mental health and addictions, right? So it's a spin-off. They're both being covered. 41, the public inquiry into MMIWG. If you look at the site, there's basically three categories that account for the activity. One is the government commitments to missing and murdered Indigenous women. So there's different programs, there's different funding, different things got designed specifically for that. There's also a section on gender-based violence. So all of the provinces have gender-based violence programs, as the federal government does, which is not specific to Indigenous, but they all have an Indigenous subset of it. And then the targeted Indigenous groups, and that could be mainly the MMI, missing and murdered Indigenous women. So this is, as you can see, these are all the ones that had the most activity across the country. Now we'll go on to the problems. There were 4,403 problems. As you can see again, BC led the way after Canada. And the main themes were justice, and that's primarily because of all of you look at systemic racism, has been a big problem, but this gives you an idea in terms of what where they're located. This is a snapshot of each of those themes. These are sort of the sub-themes. So within justice, it gives you the ranking of how they ranked on the site. Under the environment, specific industry issues, shows you just 31% of the calls were specific industries, named industry, whether it's whether it could be an oil company or a mining company, different things like that. So this gives you a sense of what all that is all about. Now this one, this is non-government. This is the only non-government slide that's in this. And last year, one of the things that Indigenous Watchdog did a scan and survey of all of the faculties of social work, faculties of schools of nursing, the law societies, the faculties of law, and schools of journalism, to see how well are they complying with the call to action for a mandatory course on a number of different components, including Indigenous laws, Indigenous health, UNDRIP, Aboriginal rights and treaties. And this gives you the results, how many were approached, how many responded, and what the course compliance is. So you can see the only ones, the Law Society is in progress. The law has done better than everybody else, for the most part. But you can see there were 196 approached, 137 responded. So there's 137 pretty detailed documents on the site that give a detailed response of how are the universities responding to this call to action, how are they responding as well to reconciliation, and it gives I think, good insight in terms of what the education community is doing to try to move the needle. But when you see the course compliance, 44% in nursing, 57% law societies, 29% journalism, 75% social work. I mean, Murray Sinclair said, if education got us into this mess, education will get us out. Based on this, I'd say the education's got a long way to go to be able to move that forward. And I just wanted to close with one final slide that shows this is stuff that's been happening this month. And a lot of it has to do with what I've already talked about, Bill 5 in Ontario, Bill 45 in BC, about Alberta, the sovereignty referendum. So this is all stuff that's happening this month to give an indication of what's still going on. And I just wanted to close with one. If you look at the logo of Indigenous Watchdog, there's 4 images. It's the images for the First Nations, for the Métis, for the Inuit, and you'll notice that the Canada maple leaf is at the bottom. I mean, that's the foundation, that's where reconciliation has to come from, and it has to go up. They have to be able to lift up and remove the barriers that are getting in the way of advancing reconciliation to those 3 groups. I know I've talked about a lot of different negative things that have been happening across a wide range of issues. That being said, there is a lot of positive things that are happening. I mean, there's in all jurisdictions, they're all doing something. Just that the challenge is how do you eliminate the problems in child welfare, in justice, in health, in language and culture, in education. I mean, that's what's going to move the needle in terms of reconciliation and advancing it to a place where it actually becomes a success. And hopefully you've had some insight as a result of this presentation in terms of what some of those challenges are. And hopefully some people will be empowered to be able to go to the site and to be able to navigate through it and find particular areas within your own work or whatever the field happens to be able to help craft the solutions that can move that needle forward and ultimately make reconciliation a success. And that's it. Thank you.